Well, welcome. It's great to be back on a stage with you. I hate to think how long it's been since we've done anything like this,
Well,
Preston.
thank you for that very glowing. I think I might run for election again.
Yeah. Well, I think you're ineligible for a Senate appointment, so it's your only hope.
Yes, no, they would dig up some of the things we said about the Senate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it sleeps 108.
Yeah. Anyway, so federal election night, 1993. For those who remember, and really unprecedented, I think since Confederation, not even 1921 comes close. Governing parties virtually wiped out. 2 of the 3 traditional parties are no longer have official party status. A third of the seats in the parliament, 54 for the Bloc, 52 for Reform. As Deborah Gray used to say, we got a full deck, they got the jokers. A third of the seats go to brand new or virtually brand new political parties, which had barely existed a few years before. Canada's a political revolution. On the other hand, you know, you and I, we ran in 1988. There was no political revolution. 1993 there is. So tell us about the thoughts on that night and what happened.
Well, like you and I have talked about, I think this is close as Canada will come to a revolution. I mean, we're not a revolutionary people. I mean, our revolution wasn't like the French Revolution, where we're too polite to chop off heads. Our revolution was not like the American Revolution. Environment Canada wouldn't give us a permit to put tea in the Toronto Harbour. But the changes that you mentioned are pretty fundamental. The governing party that went from 150-some seats to 2, and a third of the seats in that parliament going to parties that virtually hadn't existed 5 years before. So I think that's the closest thing to a revolution. One little thing, because I was in at some of the other sessions today, and one of the speakers made a point about how one vote can sometimes change. We lost 3 seats in Edmonton by a total of 329 votes. Wow. That made the difference between whether the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament was a federalist party or a separatist party. If Quebec had gone the wrong way on that night and we were here in that referendum, I was going to go back to Edmonton and say there are 400 people here who are, if you had voted the other way, the Bloc used that position of official opposition in the Parliament to build its case for separation. So
very effectively.
The absolute importance of voting, you never know how much, and in that election that was very important.
Yeah, really was.
Yeah.
Really was.
Well, now, like we got down here as members of Parliament in 1993, but of course our first member was Deborah Gray, elected in 1988 in the Beaver River riding. And you came down, I think we assigned you to come down with Deborah as her executive assistant, her policy advisor, and her bodyguard, because Deborah had to put up with a lot of abuse. So what do you remember from those years? Because that was really the first Reform presence in Ottawa.
Well, look, it was an exciting time. I mean, we were new, and it was you know, new horizons. I'd been, as you know, before in Ottawa as a political assistant, as a policy legislative assistant. But yeah, being with the one MP of a new party was a unique and challenging experience. I think, as you remember, Preston, I spent a year plus here and then seemed to promptly go into the hospital for 6 months afterwards. But look, here's what I remember, a couple of things. Deborah had a rough ride. It was not easy. She was here challenging a whole bunch of things that were a consensus, you know, right across the 3 parties in Parliament. And particularly as, you know, when she first got here, it wasn't bad. But as the party was picking up in the polls and threatening people, it got more and more difficult. And she got some, you know, pretty rough treatment and we got some pretty rough treatment from a lot of people. But there were exceptions. And I always tell people one of the exceptions, you know, it's funny, these things really stick with you. One of the great exceptions was John Turner. John Turner, I recall when Deborah gave her maiden speech in the House of Commons, John Turner made a point of making himself available, came down, asked her a couple of softball questions afterwards, always treated her with respect and as a real gentleman. And you know, ultimately, you know, I kind of really became very close to Mr. Turner for the rest of his life after that. It was quite marked compared to how she got treated by so many others. So that's a good story. But look, I'll tell you another one. It's really tough in it, but it tells you about the era. Of course, one of the things she came down was she was opposed to the Meech Lake Accord. You know, a big constitutional, a set of constitutional amendments signed by not just all the provincial governments, but signed on to by all three federal political parties. But the truth is, by the time she got down here, support for the Accord in the country was no more than 50-50, probably less. And of course, it ultimately unraveled. But I will never forget, and I don't think she'll ever forget, partly because I wrote the question for her, and I don't think she, at that point, quite understood what a hornet's nest it was. I asked her, I gave her a question that she got up and delivered in the House of Commons, hammered Mulroney on the deficiencies of the Meech Lake Accord. And this was the first time in 2 years anyone had raised any objection to the Meech Lake Accord on the floor of the House of Commons, despite the fact that over 50% of the public was against it. And the House was just, it was a combination of electric but also like petrified that this kind of debate was happening. And so, yeah, I'll remember some moments like that. But it was an interesting time.
Well, speaking of the Meech Lake Accord, one of the things that was a godsend from reform was in 1992, of course, there was the Charlottetown Accord referendum, not a constitutional referendum. And Reform participated in that. We were opposed to it, but we had a whole bunch of constitutional positions of our own. And in 1992, we conducted what would be called today an issue campaign, basically an issue campaign. It was not to get elected, but was to present a certain position, and because it was a referendum, there was actually a vote at the end. And in order to participate in an issue campaign, you have to do all the same things that you have to do in an election campaign. So here's a brand new party. But in 1992, we had to have constituency organizations, they had to have meetings, they had to distribute literature, they had to raise money, they had to get out the vote. And that issue campaign was really what prepared Reform to fight the 1993 federal election. And what it brings to my mind today is I think issue campaigns are an excellent training ground for electoral politics. And I kind of wonder what even the Conservative Party of Canada might do in the next year. Is there an issue campaign that would logically fit into what Pierre is advocating that might, again, sort of tool up the machine to do what's going to have to be done in 2024? Well,
look, I would say, first of all, obviously with the renewal of inflation and some of the further economic difficulties I expect, you know, there's going to be lots of opportunity to push issues and push issues on a sustained basis. And from, you know, my observations many miles away, I think the leader is doing those things. Now, you're not going to entirely like my answer to this, Preston, which is that, you know, that issue campaign, and it was, I think, the culmination of a series of issue campaigns the party had run, Reform had run on constitutional matters. And we'll talk about some of the other issue campaigns the party had run. Those things, I would say, were, like they were, for all the reasons you explain, not just the training, but they were essential, not just to build up the party, but to put the party on the map. You know, before 1993, we had one MP and briefly for a time, one senator, the late Stan Waters. We were, you know, there was no guarantee, as you know, even probably early in the 93 election, no guarantee we were going to turn into an official recognized party. So the party had to do something to just raise its profile. It wasn't in Parliament, and they let Deborah get up and ask a question once every 2 months, you know, and so how do you stay relevant? How do you get in the news? How do you think? We had to do those kinds of things. The advice I give Conservative opposition leaders these days is quite different. I tell them, I mean, obviously, get on some issue themes, but you know, the Conservative Party of Canada doesn't have to do anything today to be the major contender for power in the next election. It is. It will be the. In fact, with the NDP as a branch plant now of the Liberal Party, you know, geez, only Jagmeet Singh could walk into a room with Trudeau and come out with a deal where he gets nothing. I mean, you know, seriously. I just look. I say this is out of pure jealousy. I just wish I'd had an opposition leader like that somewhere. You know, support me and I'll make sure you never have to go back to the voters, or at least for 5 years. You know, the Reform Party, or sorry, the Conservative Party will be the contender for power, period. So I think that it is, what I say to Conservative opposition leaders is, your job today, broadly speaking, indicate a direction you're going to go, but it's not to talk about how you would run the country. It is to hold the government accountable for how it is running the country and making it where it's mismanagement, incompetence, and corruption. That's the job. And I really worry, and I know the people say develop the plans, develop the proposals, but I worry that that's what the Liberal media here wants Pierre Poilievre to do. Make himself the issue, let them hold him accountable,
for his solution.
While the government you know, continues on what I think is, for the most part, a pretty poor course, and they're off the hook. The time to tell people about your alternatives in detail is in an election campaign. And look, what's important though is, while you're not talking about those details now, you better be developing them in the meantime. And I can tell you from experience, once you get into office, you better have some idea then what you're going to do, because it ain't going to fall into your lap. And look, unfortunately, when Pierre becomes the next Prime Minister, and I believe that's going to happen, he's going to face. I was very fortunate, you know. I was one of the rare Conservative Prime Ministers in 100 years who came to office when things were actually pretty good, and I don't think Pierre is going to come in under those kind of circumstances.
No, that's true. One of the benefits, or just going back to Charlottetown, or to any kind of a campaign, and I know there's a lot of younger people here that have been studying campaign techniques, is the importance of when we had a lot of meetings, 200-300 meetings a year, is to hang around afterwards. And it's not just for glad handing and smiling at people. Listen hard to what people will try to say back to you, what you were saying to them. But they will say it in language and with analogies that they would use, that they were trying to explain what you were saying to them to somebody else. And one of the ones I remember from Meech Lake and Charlottetown, of course, because these were arguments with constitutional things. You could put people to sleep by. We had a big, long thing reciting on all the previous attempts to try to get national unity through constitutional change and how they failed. But it was dull, and you'd put a crowd like you to sleep. And after one of those meetings, I think it was during the Charlottetown Accord, I was talking to people after, and then this guy says to me, he says, we're like kids in the back of the car, he says, and we're trying to get to this place called national unity, and we're just saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Well, I refrained we're like kids in the back of the car, and we let Pierre Trudeau drive the car for a while, and he's giving guys the finger out of the, and he says it's over by some lake then, and then we let Joe drive the car, but Joe forgot to put gas into the law very long. And then now Brian says it's over by some other, this Charlottetown thing, and we're just saying, and Rennie Levesque's in the back saying he's going to be sick if we don't let him out. And, you know, I carried that whole argument of constitutional attempts to reform or unite the country through constitutional change, and it was based on an analogy like that. And I think it's important in any of this campaign to listen hard to what people are saying back to you, because they will use language and illustrations that can be useful to you in election campaigns, referendum campaigns.
But look, I'd also add to all that, Preston, what is forgotten now is it wasn't just the positions that people had on those issues. that those weren't the issues that people actually cared about. Like we were, early 90s, we were entering a recession.
Yeah, yeah.
And everybody wanted to focus on the economy and budgeting and taxes, and the governments were focused on constitutional debates.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was devastating.
Yeah.
But one of the other issue campaigns you led, was, say, not just constitutional stuff, was, because there's nothing new under the sun, was dealing with a fiscal mess.
Yeah, that's right. Budget balancing.
One of the main issues in '93 that you had prepared us for was the need to balance the federal budget. Reform had developed around actually before I think it was really had come together, as I recall, before the actual Charlottetown referendum. We developed the 0 and 3 plan for balancing the budget, which they said couldn't be done. And that was a big part of the campaign in 1993. So maybe we can talk about, since we're back to unbalanced budgets in a fairly spectacular way. What's the same and what's different compared to 30 years ago?
I think one of the big differences, and you'll remember that, the Liberals, like in there, they had the Red Book in 1993. They had 2 pages in it on fiscal stuff. They weren't crusading on fiscal matters, but they didn't disagree with the overall objective that you had to balance the budget. What they criticized, you guys are going too fast, you're doing it wrong. But they didn't disagree with the ultimate objective. And of course, when Chrétien was elected in 1993, and his pollsters came into him after and said, look, these idiots got 2.5 million votes crusading along this stuff, including, so Chrétien being a pragmatist, he was, let's balance the budget. Yeah. But today, I don't see any acceptance even of the objective of balancing the budget. And I think that's a deterioration from the situation that we were in.
Yeah. Look, just if I bore the audience with some numbers, I think people really don't grasp this kind of scale of fiscal mismanagement. Now, look, global pandemic, in many ways like the global financial crisis, but a lot worse. Governments around the world were faced with very unique and circumstances nobody had managed in 100 years. But and every government went into deficit, but some did it a lot more than others. As I tell people, the deficit run in, I think it was 2020, 2021, which is a couple of years ago now, that deficit was larger, about 25% larger, than the entire budget I presented to Parliament in 2015. Yeah. If I had presented, I see Tony there and a couple of others, Candace Bergen, if I'd gone into Parliament 2015, I told Joe Oliver, reduce the GST to 0, we'd gone 765, make it 0. Corporate taxes, we'd taken 22 to 15, make them 0. Make every level of income tax from the pauper to the billionaire, make it 0. Eliminated all customs, excise duties, etc. If we'd gone into Parliament and I told Joe Oliver to present a 0 revenue budget, we would have had a lower deficit than we did 2 years ago. Okay? I mean, this is... Now, that's the negative side. The positive side is the debt levels are not nearly as bad as they were back then. But no, look, there's been such dependency created during that time. I worry what's going to be done, because I agree with you. The public's not ready for it. I don't think the public knows how they would adjust. But look, the history. Here's the history, as you know this, I studied this, the history of deficits is this. And in a way, I think maybe we did the country a disservice. We ran what we thought was a really large deficit in 2009, 2010, that whole period. We thought it was a really large deficit. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what's happened the last 3 or 4 years. But we ran that deficit, and then we gradually returned the budget to balance, which is kind of what the kind of standard economics tells you you're supposed to do. But the truth is that almost never happens.
Yeah.
Usually when governments start running a deficit, and especially what happened after 2015 where you ran a deficit for no reason other than you needed more money to spend, what happens is the deficit just tends to get worse and worse until you get a crisis. And look, I fear that that the public is not ready, and we will at some point we'll face a really serious crisis, and the kind of cuts and the kind of reordering, restructuring be necessary will be really difficult. As you know, Preston, what is never talked about, yeah, Chrétien and Martin balanced the budget in 1995, after 1995, but they ended up doing 0 and 2 and doing a whole lot of things we never even thought were necessary because they had delayed. So look, this is what I fear, and so I do hope that Pierre and people around him are, trying to impress upon the country that we've at least got to make progress and got to have some plans.
Yeah, and a couple of political things about the campaign against our balancing budget. When Reform adopted that 0 and 3, our pollsters told us, well, you can go crusading on that, but only 20% of the public think it's an issue. And of course, instead of saying, well, I guess we can't do that because only 20%, no, we're going to change the public's head on that. And by golly, 3-4 years after that, the number of people that said that was an issue, by the time we got to the 1993 campaign, that was getting close to 40 to 50%. Like, just because the polls say your particular idea is not that popular today doesn't mean you abandon it.
Well, look, I love, there's a quote of all people, Bob Ray. Bob Ray once said, "A poll will never tell you how the next poll will be different."
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And look, one of the things that you deserve credit for on that and on so many things is changing public opinion. I mean, our role as elected people, as leaders, is not to just read polls, it's to shape a public opinion. And that's what you did.
And why don't we have... We often have trouble with the media and with the mass media. Like, we're crusading on this and they paid very little attention. But I don't know if you remember this in Calgary, Stephen. We put on a very big rally on this whole 0 and 3 thing.
Right.
Just after Mazankowski. We were worried sick in Mazankowski's budget if maybe in the last moment they were going to start doing something. It was a $50 billion deficit. So we put on this huge rally in Calgary, and I think we had a couple of 3,000 people at it, and this 0 and 3, and I think you went through a lot of the economics. The Calgary Herald and the main media didn't cover it at all, not at all. And we got madder than boiled owls about that. And we had enough members in Calgary, so we got our members to cancel their subscriptions to the Calgary Herald. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. We got small businesses that had ads in the Herald to just cancel your advertising for a day or two. You can go back the next day, but just to fire a shot across their bow. About 6 hours after all of this, I get a call from Ken King, the publisher, saying, "What the hell is going on?" So I went in to see Ken. I said, "We put on one of the biggest political meetings in Calgary on a subject that's important, and you guys didn't cover it at all. And we can punch back. We can't do it all over the country, but by golly, we can punch in Calgary." And 2 days later, there was a great big spread in Calgary. I know you can't do that all the time, but there are opportunities. And
well, now you have to take away not just the readers, but also their government subsidies. So
yeah, that's right.
That's the difference. Anyway, look, 1993. Back to that. Both us, Reform and Bloc, ran bottom-up campaigns, and both were. Well, we're going to talk. We talked about the economics. Let's talk about populism, pros and cons. I talked about it. Still a controversial topic. What can the Conservative Party in opposition today learn from kind of populist experience going into the next election?
Well, I guess that's a huge subject, and you touched upon it in your speech. One thing I think for federal politicians, no matter what party they are, is to understand what's the distinguishing characteristics of the politics in the different parts of this country, because they're different. Well, this is a sidebar, but remember at one of our Manning conferences, we had a panel of conservatives where we asked them, what's the distinguishing characteristic of conservatism in your part of the country? So the fellow from Atlantic Canada said tradition. The fellow from Quebec said nationalism. The fellow from Toronto said business. The Prairie guy, which was Link Byfield, said revolution. And the BC guy said polarization of being at the right end of the pole. These are all conservatives whose perception or conception of conservatism ran from tradition to revolution. But in trying to understand the underlying politics of the different parts of the country, one of the fundamental ones, which you touch on, is that nationalism is in Quebec. All those third parties had a nationalist, everything from the Bloc Québécois to the Bloc Populaire, the Union Nationale, the PQ, the Créditistes, all had that. And in Western Canada, that populism is to the political culture, the West, what nationalism, soft nationalism is to Quebec. And you know, in North America, you could argue that no part of the country in the 20th century had more experience with populist movements, populist governments than Western Canada. Now, the thing that you touched on, Stephen, like populism does have its wild and woolly side, but the Western Canadian populism has had some enormous positive contributions. The first woman that got elected to this parliament over here, how did she get there? She didn't get there through the traditional parties. She got there through the old progressive farmers' parties, Agnes Campbell MacPhail. And that's whenever Deborah went in the house, there's a little statue of Agnes Campbell MacPhail. Deborah would always pat her on the head going in there. The famous five that got women recognized as persons in Canadian law, four of those five were members of populist movements. The first one to get elected in Alberta in 1918 didn't even belong to a political party. She belonged to the so-called non-partisan league, which was one of these populist bottom-up things. Whether you agree with Medicare or not, the concept of universal access to health care was pioneered by the CCF in Saskatchewan. This is a populist movement. The biggest constitutional amendment that the West ever got, that the God sent to the West in terms of getting its control over natural resources, the 1930 constitutional amendment, was achieved by the United Farmers of Alberta Populist Party, aligning with populist members in the House of Commons. So the West's experience, populism can have its wild and woolly side, but that populist energy can be harnessed, some very positive and constructive objectives. And if one is a populist and a populist leader, that's one of the challenges, is to make sure that it's channeled in that positive direction. And we used to use analogies from the oil patch. Like in the oil patch, there's such a thing as a wildcat well that's drilled into a formation where you don't know what's down below. And then there's a rogue well where you've got a wildcat well that catches on fire, and it can be dangerous as the Dickens. There's some classic cases in Leduc Oil Patch, Atlantic number 3. But the way you tame a rogue well is you drill in from the side. And the angle got to be right. If it's too shallow, it won't take off enough pressure. If it's too deep, it can turn into a rogue well. But if it's just right, it takes off enough pressure so that valves can be installed. And now that energy, that enormous energy, can be harnessed to something good. And we kind of thought of the Reform Party. There was a lot of Western alienated. There was a separatist elected to the Alberta legislature. We thought of it as drilling in that relief well to the rogue well of Western alienation and harnessing that energy to something constructive. So there's my...
And look, and I think that probably describes the challenge the Conservative Party will have in the next election. I suspect we're having difficult times now. They're going to get more difficult, and there's going to be a lot of anger and a lot of bad ideas out there. We see it throughout the world, and the party's job will be to channel that into something positive and workable. One other topic maybe, along those lines, it's not a secret in this country, throughout the Western world, people say in polling and elsewhere, losing faith in democracies and democratic institutions. What's there from and that was not unlike the time we were in. What's there from our experience that we can use to restore faith in that today?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a critic of the way democracy is practiced in Canada, but having said that, the reform story is that 5 people met in a boardroom in Calgary in 1987. Jim Gray, Bob Muir.
Bob Muir. Yourself.
Ted Byfield.
Ted.
There's 5, and said we're not happy with the way things are going, and so why don't we take the tools that democracy gives to everybody: the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to try to persuade people to vote this way and that way, and try to change this. And even in our little group, we couldn't agree on what the first step was. I was in favor of reviving the third-party tradition. Other people said, well, maybe you create a bit new, bigger, better pressure group. Jim Gray was, we cannot work through the Conservative Party one more time. We couldn't agree on that, so we'll say we'll have a conference. We'll have a democratic conference and we'll have a decision, and that's how it got. But what I'm saying is that 5 people, starting with 5 people, took the tools that democracy gives to us all and used that to build one party, and then we, the Canadian Alliance, we got managed to rope in Ralph Klein, Philman, and of course Mike Harris was an enormous boost to that. And then you and Peter took that the next step, and you created a minority government party and a majority government party. Something that started with 5 people using the tools that democracy gives to every one of you and everybody in the country. And there are not many countries in the world where you could do that today. You could not do that in the United States. We had no money. We had no money. And so I say to people that you can lose faith in democracy, but I think we still have those tools, and I think they can be used and they can be employed to improve the position of large numbers of people.
So I gather you have some recollections you want to share with me, personal ones.
I have one more recollection here. You see, like when reform started, we had no money and we needed a policy chief. So I'm trying to think, where can we get a policy guy? We have got no money. Graduate students, some of them are starving, so they don't take much money to get. So I asked Robert Mansell. You remember Bob Mansell?
Oh, yeah.
He was an economist at the University of Calgary. I was in the consulting business. I knew Bob from something else. And I said, who is your brightest graduate student, economics student, that might be interested in a political adventure? And he gave me one name, and it was the name of Stephen Harper. And he said, you know, Stephen, he's living with, I think it's your brother and John Weisenberger. And he said, I think if you buy them pizza, you could get their intellectual capital for at least for a weekend. So with that's what we did, and that's how Stephen became the initial policy chief of the Reform
And I'm
Party.
tempted to say you got what you paid for.
But Stephen was still a student, and he eventually produced his master's thesis.
Eventually, yeah.
Yes, and it's on the exotic subject of the relationship between fiscal cycles and electoral cycles. I think the idea was, do governments end up spending and greasing the wheels during an election year or not? It's quite a profound tome, actually. And I have one of the only copies, and it is a signed copy. And it also ends, like it ends with this sentence. This is typical of an economist. Let me just find it here. Since there is no reason to believe that these matters are entirely deterministic, not sure what that means, but these are the last 9 words of this thesis. There may be room for political action as well. So it's a prophetic document.
That was pre-populist language, yeah.
So I think this is a highly valuable document, and I think we should auction this off here, Stephen. Like I think we could raise some money for Pierre with this. I think it's worth. Well, I would start at $150,000.
Look, for what was little more than a pamphlet, the government was going to pay the Kielburgers $900 million. So, I think maybe we can go to $250 at least. Yeah.
So if there's anyone out there afterwards that would be willing to put up $250,000, just come and see me after, and I'll be happy to deal with you.
Great.
So thank you all very much.
Preston Manning, everybody. Thank you very much. That's great. Okay.